Welcome, everybody. This is Hugh Massie, the Executive Chairman and founder of DNA Behavior International. And today I'm delighted to be hosting another Behavioral Economics Today podcast. And in these podcasts, we're always trying to focus on topics that are at the intersection of psychology, economics, how do people make decisions, and importantly, how do we take this important work and make it practical? And today, I'm delighted to have with me Frank Corrado, who's actually collaborated with DNA Behavior for the last 10 years or so. He's operating at a very deep level in the use of human behavioral systems, not just ours, but there are also other collaborative technologies and solutions that he's deployed in working with clients to be their financial life guide. I think, Frank, that's uh, a term that's it's worth bringing out at the
Yes.
start. But I wanted to have Frank today for this conversation because of his work in the last 30 years in the financial services industry, not just with us but overall. And now he's formed Pivot Point to be a leading practice management firm to show advisors how to embed behavioral intelligence as an infrastructure layer in their business. And that's what we want to go to the next level. I think everybody's good at dealing with the quantitative side of the business that's been done to death. How can we do the qualitative side better, which is really where the value sits for the future? So welcome, Frank.
Thank you, you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure
Well,
to be
thank you
here.
again. Thank you for all of your support over the years. And I really loved the sort of the seminal paper that you sent to me and Leon some weeks ago about why you formed Pivot Point and the work that you'll be doing in the future with behavior as the foundational layer. So maybe it's sort of good to just talk about your 30-year journey in providing wealth management advice and how you got to see and experience understanding hardwired behavior, a person's natural hardwired behavior being so important.
Certainly will do that. And interestingly, once I learned your story, we tracked a little bit. I started many years ago as a CPA. So,
Yeah.
we kind of went along the same path. You probably got to where you are now quicker than I did. So I was always on the accounting side. Went to worked at a big bank in New York City, but again, mostly on the controllership side. So it was primarily financial related. And, I got my kind of midlife crisis when I started to realize that, there was more to life of what to do. So I kind of retired from my first career and went out, got my CFP. And I felt that, I did it. I was able to so-called retire, start my own business. I said, well, I figured this out. I'm sure other people would like to know. And that's when I first realized that, the first person I worked with, I told them what to do, or how to do it. It didn't work. And the second person didn't work. And then the third person didn't work. I said, this is not, I don't have all the answers to this. And it took me a while to realize that, what it was. And then I started to do some getting a coaching certification, became a registered life planner. And so I started to get more to the behavioral side. And I worked with DNA Behavior through Fidelity, the advisor, years ago, and they had a pilot. And ever since then, it's been instrumental in my practice to be able to assess clients at a level that they can really relate to. And so um, it's, the behavioral part really puts the boundaries up, puts the parameters up for which an advisor or a guide, as you suggest, can deal. I mean, it puts some perspective around. It's just not, it's tough when everyone tries to scale, but everyone's unique. So, knowing behaviors is really, really important if you put that into your thinking pattern when working with clients.
Yeah, and every client is unique, and that's within the family unit as well. With if we're dealing with mum and dad or partners, then you deal with children. Every person's unique, but it's also possible to do this in a scalable way, I think.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, yeah, I told you the story that, I was always using DNA behavior, and it was probably after a couple of years, I said, well, I should just do it with my wife. And I did it with my wife, and it was like unbelievably telling. I mean, it was just an incredible experience just doing having a discussion with my wife about our individual behaviors, and it's something that we knew for over 40 years, but we never kind of now it was named, now it was out there, now that we knew we had a name on it, and it became something that really, really improved our relationship after all these years. So it's from a personal perspective, and the same with clients.
Yeah, I think that, some people have a perception of assessments as something that's potentially not as negative or it's limited. But my experience with deploying the DNA behavior system now, directly or indirectly, with 3.5 million people participating, is what you've discovered, and that's what I discovered when I first started using the system, Frank. This approach in my own wealth management business. Back in 2001, I think that having it in a report format levels the playing pitch for a husband and wife like you and your wife. And there will always be something that you see that's maybe a little bit new or certainly clarifying, that frees up the conversation to talk about it and provides a bit more understanding as to why this behavior has always been going on. Because the fact is I think that's, what natural hardwired behavior is all about. Is it's persistent there all the time, particularly under pressure. And that can, of course, cause stresses in marriages, but it can also relationships, partnerships, workplace. But it's also an opportunity too.
Yes. Yeah, and you mentioned making, decisions on the stress. I mean, typically when stressful situations come up, it's usually around something that's pretty important to the client, maybe a legacy or a family situation or a relationship. And at that time, they're not thinking logical at all. I mean, forget about a portfolio. This is about their life now. And so the key here is once you know the behavior, you can get an assessment of, they're looking primarily at safety. I mean, they just worried about what's my risk and will I be okay at the other end of this? And if they're not ready to make a decision, then that's got to be acknowledged, and you got to give them the right space. So, and that's why these behavioral assessments are not one and dones. They have to be incorporated into every conversation. And it is going to take some time for an advisor to be able to remember each of his clients. But once they do, they should spend some quality time, 5 minutes before a meeting, just refreshing themselves on the client. And it's not about their tax position or their estate planning. It's just like, how does this conversation really, how can I get the most out of this next conversation?
And I think to sort of address that, technology now allows it to happen. It's pretty easy to put the person's, profile report or key insights into a CRM system, Salesforce, HubSpot, Redtail, or whatever is being used. So there's no excuse for it not being accessed. Or just go to our system. It's pretty easy to make that, to configure it so that, as you say, before every meeting. I mean, this is a lifetime thing, not a once and done event. And I think that, for advisors, part of the development for them is just to understand, and this is what I learned out of one client meeting one day. I came out so drained. This was before I had the system, but I came out so drained. And I reflected later, once I was using, what is today DNA, that, yeah, this was because the communication wasn't right and it was tiring. And I could see that happening in some employee or team member interactions as well, that, I have my way of communicating, but if that didn't land with the other person I was conversing with, it became tiring. It wasn't necessary that we would philosophically disagree over something. It's just how communication happens, whether it's, verbal or in writing or however, it happens. I think that's um, something that's so important here. But, Frank, I think that what you're saying is, and this is what's hitting my mind, is that in wealth management, so much of it gets reduced down to the investment management piece, because in a way, the advisor is paid on assets under management. And in a way, that's also what clients are expecting. Okay, what are my returns? And the advisor's focused on the investment management piece, but really what they're wanting is help on to achieve their goals. That requires potentially some kind of behavioral change, thinking changes. but the advisors, not all the advisors are like you and are going to that place. You know, they're sort of trying to say, yeah, I'm a goals focused player and I'm going to help you achieve your goals. But then the next minute, it's all flipped to, well, here's the returns that you're going to make, and that's pretty easy in a rising market.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. 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 Well, you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, I think that, I've seen that for many, many years. That's why when I started my practice as a full comprehensive financial planner, fee only, all that, so fiduciary, and so that, that kind of foundation was very helpful to me. But what I find is that, there's some advisors, they say they're going to be doing goal-based planning, but they'll take some information, they'll do a questionnaire or something, and then they don't act on it. I mean, nothing ever gets done, right? It's that friction. And some of it is the client. And I think that from that perspective, that's the behavioral aspect of knowing when a client is ready and what their traits and struggles are. But on the other hand, I think what happens is that the fear I have with this oncoming of AI is that, you know, clients are going to start to have to get to understand some of the behavioral side. And if they start that, it's very dangerous if they don't follow through, because if you're expecting people to expose their vulnerabilities to you, to get that, to go from a problem-based planning approach to a purpose-based planning approach, then the worst thing you could do is open that door and then close it right away. And then from that perspective, you will not have any durability. So from that perspective, you probably lose clients from an AI world, from an investment portfolio. Um, and even from a planning portfolio, clients now to me. I mean, if I'm seeing it now, they're calling me after having gone to ChatGPT. But they still call me because they know that I'll put the behavioral aspect, or I'll help them. I will guide them. I will not make recommendations. I'll guide them to that decision.
that's the thing that you just ended on the right word there that I was going to bring up, that really now we're in a world of helping advisors have got to be in a world of helping clients optimize their decision making, and that's going to be the role in the future. And to optimize decision making, you need to understand everything about who the client is and their data. I think that, AI in a way is not completely new. It's been emerging in varying forms for 10 years. And we've got plenty of wealth tech type tools out there that are good at dealing with the data side of the game, but they're not very good at dealing with what's going on under the surface in terms of clients' emotions, biases, belief systems, and how that interacts with the data. You and I are both accountants, but we're reformed accountants because we recognize that to get to the right number, if you want to call it that, or the right decision, you've got to understand both the numbers and the person at a very deep level. And the understanding the person doesn't come just from understanding numbers. I think that's a fault that's there in a lot of systems, that these persona sort of tools or personas are built out of understanding numbers, or two people living in the same cul-de-sac
Yeah, yeah,
with $1 million and no mortgage and a spouse and two kids are not the same person, but they get treated the same. Or it's people, some advisors are dealing with billionaires and people worth $100 million and plus, and it's sort of almost like that they're special people. Well, yeah, they're successful potentially if they didn't, if they made that money themselves, but they're still unique, right? The blood in there is still red. It's not some other color.
right,
Um, and,
right.
and they need to be understood.
And, the other thing that makes it complex is that, once you go from advisor, which is usually recommendations about a problem, maybe there's a new tax law or there's some opportunity. But when you move to a guide, then you're just as important in the decision making to solve problems. But really, the what drove me all these years has been opportunities. I mean, I think, the opportunity, to me, the statement I tell all my clients is there's nothing more expensive than a missed opportunity. It's without doubt, that's most important. And you cannot discuss, first of all, AI won't give you opportunities. Or if it is, I'm not sure what LLM it's going to come from. But it's only the advisor and the intimacy with a client that can know opportunities. And so, um, And that's really what you want. That's where you make the impact. When you can show a client that is something that either they have thought of that they thought they couldn't attain, or something they never thought of at all, and just give them the opportunity, the permission, so to speak, to go after some of these things. It's life changing.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of where I'm coming to on for advisors on, my concept now of AI future proofing, and that, AI itself is an opportunity and it's a threat. And in a way, I think it's great because
So
of
do
the
I.
way, I suppose I'm an initiator style, person that's a bit more self directed. I'm reasonably well educated. It's easy for me, it's more natural for me and comfortable in a way to go and it's the way I've always done things, even when I was at college, is I like to research a concept first, get to some conclusion, and then have a conversation with someone that's got some wisdom about, okay, what's my choice here, and am I going to handle it, and have I thought it all through? And I think that with AI, clients now can go to a Claude or ChatGPT or whatever it is, Perplexity, and ask some questions, and they're going to come up with some preliminary answers to their problem. And now, what we want is the advisor to be able to see that on a bot, on the chat bot as well, and be able to interact with them to guide them on that course, and that's worth uh, you know a, a, a a lot of money to do that. And I think that's the holy grail in the future for the advisor to be able to have those higher level conversations and understand at the same time the client's emotions, because there could be two people wanting to restructure their business or their estate with similar factual circumstances, but they're driven emotionally very, and with behavioral biases a very different way. I think that's where the skill will be needed of the advisor. And that's I think the behavioral intelligence layer that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I understand that AI is both a threat and an opportunity, and I think that for advisors who are really looking to approach the human side, because you could do it from a risk perspective, because if you don't, you're going to lose clients, or you're going to get fee compression, or your business as it is now is just not going to be the same. So you could do it to try and reduce your risk from a commercial perspective, or you could just say, look, I've always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to be this kind of advisor, but I never had the capacity to do it, because taking the human side of it takes time. When clients say, well, I engage my clients once a year or twice a year. I read an article that said in order to get a friend, you need 200 interactions. So when people say, oh, yeah, my clients are my friends, and they call them once a year, I mean, do the math. It takes a long time.
That's sort of in a way, that's nonsense sales talk, and they're
Yeah.
kidding themselves.
Yes. Yes.
But, I think
So
again, this is where the AI is the opportunity, is that and advisors have to pick their battle. If the investing side is now fairly commoditized, and no one, even including the professional investment managers on a sustainable basis, can really beat the market by much. I mean, behavioral economics or behavioral finance tells us that yes, someone might have, a new way of going about things. We've built a more behavioral driven solution for evaluating the leaders of companies. Now that might create some winners, but over time. But I think in the general premise, it's hard to beat the market, and so the investment management side is largely a commodity. So why not free yourself up out of that to have more time for the human conversation, because this is where the real value add is, to be able to do these things. And luckily now the technology, including ours at DNA Behavior, is such that it's it's easy to get these insights. It's not hours of work. It's not hours of training either. You've done a lot of training, but probably in the future not as much will be needed to get to the same place, just because the tooling's there. I think you've still got to learn. People have got to learn to be a good facilitator, but I think you know where I'm going.
yeah, absolutely. And even on the planning side, there are tools out there that We use it in our well, it used to be my firm, but, on the tax side, you just ask tax questions. It comes up with all the answers with citations. I mean, you do it on the estate planning side. You put in a case, it comes out with an estate plan. You do it, on insurance. It's just on and on and on. And so, it's not gonna be very difficult to disintermediate an advisor, if in fact they're not taking the approach to really becoming more intimate with a client. And trust is going to be even more important in this new age because it's really going to be the most, I mean, I've always felt it was the number one differentiator anyway. But the problem was in the past, everyone said, trust me, it was hard to prove. But if you start now in this new world with AI, it's going to make trust very transparent. So what's going to happen is, you're going to have to, credibility used to be very, very important. Now, with all the AI, maybe not as so, but reliability, intimacy, and basically self-interest are all going to be very differentiating factors with the relationship with a client.
Yeah, I think so. So how do we, because this is a big part of pivot point in the future, your firm in the future, how do we turn this into, a behavioral operating layer that's in the business? Because I think it's more than just the tech side of it being set up the right way, which is important,
Right.
but that's sort of a given. But I think there's more to having this behavioral operating layer in the business.
Absolutely, absolutely, and to me, just like when you're dealing with individual clients and you're dealing with advisor or advisory firms, then you have to go to the DNA behavior of the firm. I mean, what does the firm want to accomplish? What does the advisor want to accomplish? What's he trying to get to, right? Because none of this is a silver bullet, right? Nothing could I could never give an operating layer, make 100 copies and send it out. I just can't. So every team, every person comes from a different place. And even within a team, even within a firm, different advisors are coming from different places, right? So you have to make this very specific to the advisor. But the first thing you need to do is have a diagnosis, have the diagnostics. Where are we going? Where you want to get to? And then you make a decision. And it's always, the process, right? So it's people, technology, and the process and the workflow. All those three things need to be adjusted. And in putting this, it has to become something that becomes part of the process of what they do. So it's, when I go in, I'm not going to, I love talking with you at, 10,000 feet about behavior and the future and white papers. But that's what not firms don't need white papers. Firms need people to come in and say, "How do I do this?" And one of the reasons why I created Pivot Point was because in my goings and my kindred spirits, even people who really believe in this behavioral side don't know how to actually implement, have a difficult time implementing in the practice. Some of it is the revenue model that you mentioned before. Some of it is clients may not, it's not maybe what they want. So you have to be able to get that process in place. And it's about giving the advisors the tools necessary, the technology tools to do it. Give them the training, okay? And it's not necessarily education. This is training to try and get it to real specific points in their process, the number of engagements, how often they meet with their clients, how often do they get back and forth, what types of meetings do they have, right? And so what happens is you make all kinds of recommendations, and then at that point in time, there's an implementation phase, right? And it's not something that's going to have to be, there's going to be if it's a firm, then there's got to be some. The firm definitely has to be behind it, and then each advisor, depending upon where they are in their place, could take it forward. But they have to realize that it's going to be, if they want to achieve this, either because they're taking the risk perspective or they're taking the optimal life perspective. Either way, the only way you're going to get to either of those is to be able to create that level of intimacy with clients.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and I want to unpack what you've just said, in maybe in a few bits to piece it together, because I agree. And everything that I've been hearing lately, around transformations, whether it's in wealth management or outside, the introduction of AI, or that AI is on our doorstep, breathing down on us like a financial tsunami. However it comes across, it's a leadership decision to start with, and that's what I think I've always seen with DNA behavior. If the CEO is bought into the power of it and what can be done with it, if done properly and in a disciplined way, then we can set sail on a winning course and get to what are all the implementation steps. Do you do a profile on somebody before you meet them? Is it done at, uh, at the second meeting? Uh, what questions get asked? How do you use the tool? How do you I've always been big, Frank, on the advisor revealing who they are to the client up front. Sharing your profile, making it less scary for the client. They know what's coming, and gee, the advisor's being vulnerable and saying, "This is who I am and my strengths and struggles."
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
normally been the winning path. But I think you're also getting to even deeper than that. It's every workflow. How is this embedded?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
to make it a great experience for both the client and the advisor. But it starts with the leader. I found that when the leaders aren't bought in, the CEO of the firm is not bought in, this tends to not ever ever go very far.
Right. Right. And the buy-in could be in many different ways. I mean,
Yeah.
there are people becoming, fractional chief behavioral officers for firms that, doesn't don't have the skills within, or they want to get to it faster. Or there are, people, even in my new firm, I'm willing to do, client-facing meetings with advisors for people who aren't comfortable doing this. And the nice thing about this behavioral side is that, you don't need to know a lot about the details of the finances to understand the client. So, I think that's where the missing link is with most advisors, because they don't put all their knowledge about the client from a technical perspective in any kind of perspective context to be able to get to an answer.
But it's almost, um, I don't know whether you're a golfer, but some of the people listening might be a golfer. But it's something that I've learned, that that it's almost like the advisors. A lot of them are spending 90% of their time or 80% of their time looking at all the financial stuff, getting all the reports ready, and collating numbers, and doing the financial analysis and investment return analysis, and thinking about all those issues. Um, Whereas, a lot of the game's won or lost on the human side, but that 80% of the investment of time is on the financial side. And it's a bit sort of like, playing golf. Everybody goes to the driving range before a golf game and spends, if they get there an hour before the game or half an hour before the game, most of the time spent on, warming up with drivers and long irons, and
Right.
maybe a few other shots, and 5 minutes on the putting green, right? But the game was won or lost on the putting green, and I got my handicap down by realizing that, I need to spend, if I go for an hour before a game, 20 minutes with the longer, iron clubs and woods, 20 minutes of chipping, and 20 minutes of putting.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what that does to your score, right? Of course, there's a mindset issue as well, but it's where you're putting your focus. And I think what you're stepping in to do with Pivot Point is to, in a way, to help firms repivot, right?
Exactly.
And balance out all of the processes. So we're not saying that the financial part's not important. It is,
It is
right?
absolutely
But
important.
it's one half of the game, and the human side's the other part. You can make a decision. Is the human part 80% of it? But uh, i- it's balancing it out, and in a way, it's integrated. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, it's being able to step in and help an advisor with some meetings, and at least teach them the fish in terms of, okay, if you want to be the financial life guide, this is a way to ask questions differently, right? I imagine that's some of what you're going to do, but then there's also all the steps of what happens with it, dealing with a prospect. Um,
Yeah,
how are
and
people?
and and the thing that's gonna make it really easy for me is firms like DNA Behavior and all those oth there are so many fintech and methodologies that are coming out now to make it easier and easier for advisors to do this. Suggested questions, conversation starters. I mean, on and on and on. Everything you have has got its own AI bot to it. And so the point of the matter is that everything is there right in front of the advisor. All I need to do is have the confidence in being able to evaluate this information and create a relationship with a client. And I guarantee they'll take you right down the right path. The client will
Yeah.
take you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the AI is a co-pilot for the client. I think it helps them become more informed. So they take more, I mean, because I'm all about self-empowerment. The client takes more responsibility for the decisions and the advisor is helping them get there. And there's not this sort of black box there as much there anymore. And I think that's the opportunity side of this.
Yes.
And so everybody performs better rather than it being an uneven game where it's a power game. The power is all in the side of the advisor. That isn't how you earn your 1% a year or 0.65%, whatever it is. That's the mindset shift that needs to change with this.
Yeah. And, a lot of what Pivot Point will be talking about, I mean, obviously there's a lot of theory behind this, but this is not about motivational speaking or inspirations, I mean, this is about process. This is about design. And in fact, one of the services I'll still be doing with clients is what I call life design. And, it becomes this question that, if you're building a house, everyone will get an architect. If you're doing a new bathroom, you get an architect. But when people come to people's life, no one thinks about being the architect of their life. No one takes the proactivity necessary to make the life that's optimal for you. And so, and it's a shame, we spend more time on our kitchens, bathrooms, and whatever than we do on our own lives. And so, I think that this behavioral stuff could be very, very changing for people who want to take that opportunity to design. A lot of it is in transition. People who are forced to make a new change. It could be death of a spouse or a divorce or a sudden money. Someone could sell a business and all of a sudden they're sitting there with a pile of money they never had before. Of course, they'll definitely be very attracted to most advisors because of the AUM. But a lot of advisors cannot really work with those kinds of people who are have new money because some of them may not be able to handle it.
Yeah, I think that the area where advisors are going to be able to have the high impact, as you allude to, are the complex life events, and some of those go on a multi-year basis. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the AUM fee. I think that when I ran my own wealth management business in Australia, I figured out just intuitively that there needed to be some AUM in there, but it also needed to be a retainer element to deal with the ups and downs of life. And I, in fact, reduced the AUM down a long way compared to everybody else at the time, and then had a retainer element in there. And it was still very profitable, but it was more aligned to what was being offered. And I think that's also something that's important in this. And so, in a way, it was sustainable. Now, I probably stopped early in my prime on the way up in building the business because I got onto DNA behavior and I was ultimately more passionate about that. But I think the fee charging model is also part of this, Frank, as well as in building the right
Yeah,
behavioral operating system in the business.
and it's a good model as a personal situation. And my firm we charge separately for planning a retainer and for AUM, and we're also a tax firm, so we charge separately for tax. And so had our annual review with a client and he said, well, I'm not sure if I really want to continue on the financial planning side. I said, fine. I said, we'll manage the money, we'll do your taxes. He said, but let me ask you a question. If my wife calls you up and asks about the retirement plan, would you talk to her? I said, no. He says, what do you mean? I said, that's planning. That's life changes. We talk about your future, what you want. That's planning. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. Yeah, we'll take it. And so they don't really understand the language. 99% of the issues or problems or questions that clients have is about their life. It's not about their portfolio. Although they'll call you about the portfolio because they don't know any other way to do it.
Which comes back to leadership and comes back to the brand promise of the firm, the positioning of the firm. And I think that's part of putting this behavioral operating layer into the business is to getting all of those elements right. It just can't be, what does the advisor do in the meeting room with the client? It's the whole thing. It's every process and every element of the firm that makes up its DNA, as you said before, that has got to be addressed.
And, you also wanna make the client durable for the firm, right? The risk a lot of firms have is if they do it all at the advisor level, then the client only knows the advisor. They don't know the firm, and there's a lot of risks in just knowing the advisor and not the firm, right? And so, there's just a ton of things that CEOs and senior people need to think about, especially in this age of M&A and, what are the firms of the future gonna look like? I think the firms and even the valuation of firms are going to be the firms that, know their clients are going to have a higher valuation. It's eventually going to get there.
It's interesting. Probably in about 2004, I did that model. I first did that model. I was helping somebody with an M&A type transaction at the time. And I said, if you could, because they were thinking about selling their business, it would behoove you to profile every client now and learn how to converse with them. And then we can work out who would be the right person to buy the business to keep the client stickier for longer. But in the meantime, you're also going to have a better business of more revenues, right? Sustainable revenue and uh, knowing the clients and be able to pass it on, right? And you not be stuck in the business as having all the institutional knowledge about who the client is in your head. Now, do you think the person did that? Nope. But should they have? Absolutely. And I think that's to your point. That's where this is going to become so important. And that while it sounds self-serving coming from Hugh, but the behavioral data is now the key element. Because if you strip away everything else, that's what you're left with. And where is that sitting?
Right.
And that's why, again, Frank, the DNA I think is important, the hard wiring, but it's also, the trapping and recording of all the conversations that sit around that. How does that integrate into all the numbers? That's still part of the data, but in a way, it's the financial behavior data. That's the key asset of the firm. And as you say, that's going to drive valuation, because the investment management piece is only worth a few basis points. There's a long way between that and the 1% that's being charged. And like the situation you just mentioned, if the client doesn't see the value in the planning, well, they'll just pay a few $1,000s to have a tax return done and watch their portfolio on Vanguard, right?
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I think I want to keep drilling in on that this is a process, even though we've got technology, but it doesn't have to be hard. We're not talking about um, making this being something that's difficult or awkward. In fact, we're really saying it's going to free up a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna be for a whole host of reasons, gonna be actually easier for the advisor, right? And not only
Yeah.
is it to create capacity, but having the, number 1. Number 2, training, advisors to understand that they have their own biases and get them that whole emotional intelligence piece out of the equation. Let them understand, is it them speaking or is it the client? Putting the focus on the client, and once you put the focus on the client, then at best, you're gonna get to shared accountability. Because right now, a lot of advisors, it's kind of like, oh, they don't listen to me. It's just their fault, right? Or they fret over the fact that no one they're not being listened to, and they get, upset or stressed. But once you bring the client in, it's their life, and to give them that authority and that permission is very liberating for an advisor because it's no longer needing to have all the answers.
Well, I think it's important that both parties are liberated, and in a way, liberated will be different for each of them because one's an advisor and one's a client, but both are liberated to relatively
Yes,
the same degree.
exactly.
And all of the information coming to the surface is liberating, and I think that's what you're saying, because we're bringing the deep subconscious
Yeah, yeah,
to the conscious level. That's part of uncovering, the hardwired behavior is part of that. It's not all of it. And I know that you use other processes to bring up more consciousness. And I do too when I work with people, but I think that's what we're doing. And if the client decides at the end of the day to do something that we didn't think they should do or didn't see the point of, it's been done in a way with all cards on the table,
Yep. Yep.
as opposed to a misalignment between the advisor and the client. Either the advisor's just knowing way more than the client's been able to understand, or in fact, the client has held back some stuff that probably possibly could have come out, or has now used the AI tools more than the advisor has, whatever way. But what I think what we're talking about is getting it to be far more equal. That was always my goal with this. Technology is our friend for this being easy as opposed to being seen as a friction point.
Yeah. There's so much discussion in firms about client experience, and it's a big word on websites, and books written about the experience economy and all this stuff about experience. And at the end of the day, I agree that the client experience is number one. And I can't believe that it could be a good client experience if in fact the client doesn't feel they're being fulfilled in the expectations that they have, right? And if you don't have that kind of relationship with a client, you're not going to know. If you don't have a discussion about expectations, you're never going to get there. And so you're never going to have a good client, say, "Oh, we're a client centric firm." What does that mean?
Yeah.
So, it becomes again that factor within the formula of trust called intimacy, which is you cannot be a trusted advisor without having an understanding of where your client is and what they want.
I think you can have a client centered firm, at least in my view, if you're completely putting the interests of the client first and prepared to let the cards fall where they fall as far as fees, revenues, solutions, products. Obviously there's some legal boundaries within all of that. But I think if it starts there, then you've got a
Oh,
good chance
yeah,
of getting that right. Now, it may be that certain clients don't want the experience your firm's going to deliver. Well, that's a different matter.
yeah,
That doesn't mean the experience is bad.
right.
Uh, everybody's different and got a right to choose. Not everybody's going to want the DNA type experience, even though we think it's probably good for you to have it. But again, I've always said to advisors, you can go full bore on discussing the DNA profiles, or it is a backdrop, but you've got some insights that help the conversation. You don't have to, it's all about bedside manner as well. Uh,
Absolutely.
and everybody needs it in a different way at different times. Sometimes it is a full on discussion. Other times might be 1 minute, or as I said, it's in the backdrop. You're just aware that it's there, and that's how you navigate the client. It's still providing value.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and when I first was using DNA, when I'd get a client who had kind of a low score on, they wanted to be self-managed, they didn't really want to get, use advisors. I said, "Oh, what am I getting myself into?" But after a while, you start to find that those clients, you just change the approach with them,
yeah,
and they're happy. They're really happy, right? And you don't try and fight it. You don't try and take what you want to do for them. You meet them where they are, and they become great clients. In fact, they take up least amount of time.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and it could have been, it turned out, I thought they were gonna be a disaster, but they're not. They're great clients.
I know that in my time in running a wealth management business, the only client in because I didn't have DNA behavior at the start or anything like it, it evolved in the business. But the only client couple that never did it was the biggest nuisance and caused me the most stress.
Yeah.
And in the end, it was better that they in the end didn't stay as a client. Uh, and I've noted that too as I've gone along in the DNA business, generally speaking, where we've had trouble navigating a situation, it's usually been because someone hasn't done the profile, and we're in the business, but so it's usually something early on. But um, there's no doubt this works. And I suppose that leads me to sort of our concluding question, Frank, is what do you see as the success looking like for Pivot Point? As you go on your next journey, now in a way, it's another transition here, in rolling this out as a dedicated service to put the behavioral operating layer in wealth management firms.
I think that, this, given the passion I have for the topic, to me, y originally, how couldn't someone not see what we're trying to get accomplished here, right? And so, I went and I started speaking, obviously people like you and other people who are similarly, educated and have the behavioral side, but they've been in it for 10 years, right? And I'm like, "Frank, this is great. You really have a good idea. This is gonna really, be something that the industry needed, but let me tell you that you have found the elephant in the room." However, all the people in the room are blind.
Yeah.
And so, and it's kind of starkness of someone who's well respected, saying that, I'm up against something that's difficult. So I really think one of my biggest opportunities for success is to let it get to the people who get it, right? And not try and boil the ocean. I mean, it's, not to think that this is for everyone, but just to find the right number of people. And maybe we can get to some kind of tipping point, but that may not be for 5 or 10 years. The industry is so slow moving. But, it's really just, to find the right people who are willing to take the chance, to take the risk, an early adopter to do something.
And then the success becomes that they build it out into
Yeah.
every
Oh,
step of
yeah,
their business
absolutely.
from start to finish, whether it's from how, leads are generated, prospect management, uh, first meetings, the people that are hired, the whole shooting match, uh, is
Or,
addressed. That's really what.
I've been making phone calls to my clients as I've been, leaving the firm, and, it was almost like being at your own eulogy, and so it's kinda like, some of the things they said about their lives and what I've done to it. I mean, if we could have advisors experiencing that, that to me, and I know that's not a commercial way to look at it, it's not what the CEO may look at, but, to me, that's the bottom line is, people have gotten places they never would have gotten to before.
Yeah, I think that, you used an interest as we wrap up, an interesting term. It's taking the elephant out of the room, and I found that recently in something that I was doing and helping a person through a very high stakes situation, which involved litigation. But when I was able to, I wish I'd got to him at the start of the process rather than towards the end. But when I was able to help him see his mindset and how he is a trigger in the whole thing, that changed the game in terms of deciding on settlement in it. And that then changes their life because being in court all the time fighting people, it wrecks your own health, but also potentially your marriage and your business. And I think that's what we're talking about
A
here
lot at
is really
stake,
being
a
up.
lot at stake.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake, and financial advice is a high stakes thing. You know? On some days more high stakes than others, but it's high stakes all the time.
Absolutely.
Well, Frank, it's been great spending time with you. And, again, I appreciate that you're an ambassador, but more than an ambassador, I think that, you're a diehard believer in
Yeah.
the power of behavioral insights, but it's also important that it doesn't just stop at self awareness. It's about how it's used every day.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm hoping to work with your excellent team on collaboration because as an advisor for 10, for 20 years, there's so many places I can see where it actually works in a firm. And so, yeah, there's a lot to get ahead of both of us. That's for sure.
Well, I think there'll be plenty of listeners for this conversation, and,
Yeah,
and that's going to help a lot.
absolutely.